back. I am delighted to be here, and let me begin by resharing my PowerPoint presentation. Can I do a quick process check that you're seeing the Section 504 and ADA in 15 minutes cover slide?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. So this is a hazardous presentation to talk about ADA and Section 504. Many people dedicate their lives to these topics of supporting individuals with disabilities. This is as probably precarious as trying to do appendectomies in 15 minutes or less. So I want to be careful to try to give at least a broad context of information, but realize that we could certainly spend days and days on really unpacking Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if you had caught the Erich Merkle show from the spring with Neomed, I talked to you about the continuum of services. And I just want to remind, when schools are looking at supporting students with disabilities, we are not talking about places, but we are talking about what is the programs and services that they need to be able to access the school environment and what we call the least restrictive environment, which again refers to what degree does a student reside or attend school with his, her, or their neighborhood peers, within their neighborhood classroom, and within the school in their neighborhood area. So we are always attempting to provide those programs and services within that range. Section 504 is very different in some context in special education because it is regular education. And we could probably spend a good hour just unpacking this table, but it is a visual presentation of how special education, Section 504, and ADA compare and contrast. The important takeaway here is that Section 504 is civil rights legislation that applies to a lot of different contexts. Oftentimes, when we talk about support for students with disabilities in education, we are highlighting education-specific statutory language. Section 504 really applies to any entity that receives federal funding. And it is birth to death. It is lots of different environments, from public schools, including higher education. It is public accommodations and services. It can include areas as it links into the Americans with Disabilities Act, when it comes to things like universal design and architectural considerations for access. So lots of different places that 504 and ADA come into play here. We should realize when we're talking about ADA and 504 eligibility, we're looking at a prevalence rate of about 26% of the entire population having some sort of eligible disability. Some of this information I will leave as a reference point to you, particularly when it comes to how Section 504, ADA, and special ed compare and contrast. For our purposes today, understand Section 504 is oftentimes thought of as the less significant sibling of special education. It's important to appreciate, though, that Section 504 is actually the patriarch of why we have special education, because Section 504 came to us in 1973 as a part of a Workforce Rehabilitation Act that prohibited discrimination among employees in the workforce, eventually ported into lots of other contexts, as I mentioned. Special education as a education statute came to us in 75. So there was 2 years difference there. Now, Section 504 is unique because the statute itself is very straightforward and basic. It's only a couple pages, and as anyone who's ever looked at law knows, most statutory expressions of law cover thousands and thousands of pages. This is a few pages. And the definition, very straightforward. You have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits an area of major life functioning or bodily functioning. That is it. That is the eligibility component of what Section 504 requires for the accommodations and services. Now, because the statute is so basic, there has been a press for decades to try to have more concrete guidance. In fact, most of the processes we follow in Section 504, unlike special education, has been inferred to us either through case law or guidance through the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education level. There are substantive updates coming to Section 504. It was supposed to be this spring, then this summer, now this fall. In broad language, they will probably align Section 504 a little bit more to special education and probably give us some more specificity that we have all been seeking for many years in this work. Again, and I think I had a typo on your PDF version of this. I want you to really pay attention to the idea of what the definition is. A physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more areas of major life activities or bodily functioning. That is it. I think I had a typo there. I said bodily injury. I don't know where my mind was at when I was typing that, but it should say bodily functioning, not bodily injury on that slide if you have the PDF of these. Now, when we talk about a physical or mental impairment, that is simply being diagnosed with some condition, whether we are talking physical medicine or we're talking about mental behavioral health. A major life activity is, in essence, anything that is a major life activity. Any bodily function is any of our bodily functions. So very straightforward here. The one consideration is a lot of times folks start asking for support under Section 504 when they really should be looking at the area of special education. And that is true if the area of life functioning is learning. In other words, reading, writing, math, attendance in school, behavior in school. There should be a rule in and a rule out of whether or not special education is the more appropriate venue to provide those supports. Now, in that definition of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits, what do I mean by a substantial limitation? Well, again, the statute is purposefully vague. Generally speaking, it is unable to perform a major life activity that the average person in the society can perform or bodily function. That's about as much specific information and guidance as we have of what does it mean to be substantially limited. Now, Section 504 is civil rights legislation, is about civil rights. Very different, again, than special education. Special education is about trying to maximize and calibrate resources and services to produce a desired outcome to ensure progress in the general curriculum in schools. Section 504 is concerned exclusively with non-discrimination and access. As such, it provides accommodations and services. So if a provider is recommending supports for a student in a school context with a disability and accommodations are what's needed, that's where Section 504 really comes into play. If we are talking about specially designed instruction, which is adapting to content delivery and methodology of instruction, or we're talking about related services or direct services, that's where special education comes into play. Section 504 does not provide direct services. It provides accommodations and services. So a couple things to think about. When we talk about accommodations under Section 504, of course, in education, we think about what's happening in the classroom. But because Section 504 is incredibly broad, it deals with physical and mental impairments that are somehow substantially limiting either major life activities or bodily functions. It's not just the classroom. It could also involve things like medical conditions, like providing nursing. It could be support for catheterization or seizure plans or diabetes. It might involve areas like modifying your school day. So maybe you start school a little later or leave a little early. What do you do in the lunchroom? Perhaps you have a significant life-threatening allergy and cannot have exposure to a certain allergen like peanuts. You might have a medical necessity for transportation. What about if you forget what's called a mitigating measure? For example, you have a cochlear implant and forgot to attach it that day. What do we do in that case? As well as a whole spate of other contexts. So where IEPs and special education really drill down into supporting classroom settings and the accommodations and modifications in the classroom and those types of related services. Remember, Section 504, lots of different areas of the broad educational experience. And it's important to have just a clarity on this term of accommodations. This is how a student accesses curriculum or demonstrates learning. It is intended to provide equal access to learning. It is not a modification. A modification actually changes what a student is intended to know. This is not just semantics, it's an important point of clarification because Section 504 is about accommodations and services. That is it. So in Section 504 land, a few takeaway pointers. So you have a very broad definition. As long as you have some sort of qualifying either diagnosis or the presence of symptomology that reveals that you have a substantial limitation in an area of life functioning or bodily functioning, that is your potential area of being protected under 504 and ADA. If you then have a school-based evaluation, which can be a very simple process, such as a provider writing a letter saying, I'm treating Eric, Eric has ADHD, Eric's ADHD substantially limits the area of executive functioning. I might suggest these types of accommodations. That can be sufficient, assuming nothing else is going on. Or it can be the whole evaluative sequence that you see in special education, which includes things like cognitive assessment and academic skills assessment and social emotional assessment and so on and so forth. Remember, Section 504, because it's accommodations and services, do not allow what we call fundamental alterations of programs. That is to say, we can't make a AP course or an international baccalaureate course anything but those courses. We also run into this sometimes with online courses and some of the nuances of that software. Again, remember, special education is all about maximizing education, making progress in the curriculum. Section 504 is silent in that respect. Section 504 is about access and non-discrimination. Remember, Section 504 is accommodations and services. It is not about direct service. So Section 504, for example, I just had a conversation with a family who was asking about, well, I'd like a 504 plan for OT services. Well, occupational therapy as a direct service is not a feature of Section 504. That may be a component of special education. It is not of Section 504. Also keep in mind, Section 504 is not progress monitored. So you do not have annual measurable goals. So that is another very distinctive difference from, say, special education. So with that, I will pause here. I leave my contact information as a resource. Those of you who know me from the community know I do training all over the state and the region on this very topic. If you want a much deeper dive, I certainly invite you to come see one of the longer presentations. So with that, I will stop my screen share and see what questions we have or what further I can offer our team.